An unusual hush settled over the Supreme Court chamber as Representative Jasmine Crockett approached the attorney's podium. Her composure was impeccable, even as Justice Samuel Alito's relentless questioning had already interrupted her 3 times in under 5 minutes. 4 months, Alito's public speeches had raised serious doubts about his impartiality, and today, that skepticism hung in the air like a storm. "Congresswoman, that interpretation simply doesn't align with constitutional text," Alito declared dismissively, cutting her off mid-sentence. Crockett paused, meeting his gaze with unwavering calm. She reached for a leather portfolio on the table, extracting a single set of documents. When she spoke again, her voice commanded the room. What followed in that historic half-minute did more than silence Justice Alito. It exposed a truth that would reverberate through American constitutional law for years. Crockett's credentials were formidable. A constitutional scholar, former public defender, and civil rights litigator, she had spent her career protecting voting rights. Though now a congresswoman, she maintained her law license and occasionally took cases that tested the very boundaries of constitutional protections, including this challenge to restrictive state voting laws. Meanwhile, Alito had drawn scrutiny for increasingly partisan remarks at Federalist Society gatherings, expressing skepticism about expanding voting access. Ethics complaints had piled up, but with no binding Supreme Court ethics framework, they remained unresolved. As Crockett began her argument, she framed the stakes in human terms. "Chief Justice, may it please the court," she began. "The franchise represents the cornerstone upon which all other constitutional protections rest. When 53,000 eligible voters in Jefferson County were denied their ballots last November, we saw not individual misfortune, but a systemic constitutional failure." The chamber listened intently as she transitioned into constitutional analysis. The state claimed Article 1, Section 4 granted virtually unlimited discretion in election administration. Alito interjected sharply, "Isn't your real disagreement with the constitutional structure itself?" "Respectfully, Justice Alito," Crockett replied, "I am not challenging the Constitution's design, but advocating for a complete reading of its provisions. Article 1 cannot be interpreted in isolation from the Reconstruction Amendments, which fundamentally reshaped federal and state authority over elections." Crockett meticulously walked the court through the 14th and 15th Amendments, citing Reconstruction-era congressional records and Supreme Court precedents. She highlighted how the restrictive voter ID law disproportionately burdened minority voters. 83% of those turned away were minorities, despite making up only 34% of Jefferson County's population. When Alito attempted to minimize these obstacles as minor inconveniences, Crockett countered with precedent. Regulations that disproportionately burden fundamental rights must meet strict scrutiny, regardless of intent. Then came the defining moment. Crockett opened her portfolio, revealing transcripts from the 1869 congressional debates on the 15th Amendment. Quoting Senator Oliver Morton, "We are placing the power to safeguard the right to vote in the proper hands of the federal government, rather than leaving it to states unworthy of this responsibility." She read Senator Garfield and Senator Stewart's words aloud, showing that the Reconstruction Congress intended to limit state discretion over elections and ensure that voting rights were practically accessible to all citizens. The chamber went silent. Even Justice Alito shifted uneasily. Justices Kagan, Sotomayor, and Roberts leaned in, absorbing the gravity of her argument. Crockett connected these historical insights to the present case, demonstrating how the state's law undermined the constitutional protections the amendments guaranteed. Her closing was precise and powerful. This case is not about convenience versus security. It is about honoring the constitutional commitment of the Reconstruction Amendments, ensuring that the right to vote remains meaningful for all citizens, regardless of race, wealth, or status. The question before this court is whether we possess the constitutional courage to see it as clearly as they did. The courtroom remained in stunned silence. For the first time in years, history, law, and moral clarity had aligned in the Supreme Court. The aftermath reshaped American jurisprudence. Within months, Harvard Law Review dissected Crockett's historical findings. Legal scholars praised her use of originalist methodology to illuminate a fuller understanding of the Reconstruction Amendments. 3 months later, the Supreme Court struck down the restrictive law in a landmark 6-3 decision. Chief Justice Roberts established a new framework requiring heightened scrutiny whenever voting regulations disproportionately burden access, while even Alito, in a rare concurrence, acknowledged the historical constraints on state authority. Crockett's argument catalyzed reforms beyond the court. The Supreme Court adopted its first binding code of conduct. States reconsidered voting regulations. Applications from women of color surged in law schools, inspired by her performance. Scholars across ideological lines recognized the intellectual rigor of her approach. For ordinary Americans, the impact was tangible. Voter participation increased in previously suppressed communities. And for Crockett, the argument was more than a victory, it was a restoration of constitutional vision. By recovering the voices of the Reconstruction framers, she expanded the understanding of democracy itself. That day, in a hushed courtroom, Representative Jasmine Crockett did more than win a case. She reminded a nation of its highest ideals and left a lasting imprint on the promise of American democracy.